So we found 2 more ghosts. They have stepped forward and given us their names. Now keep in mind, this is not a documentary. Our ghosts have led us here, and the stories you will find are truly fascinating. I dove in deep to try and find out what these ghosts are trying to say, and oh boy did I find a story of epic proportions. Now please watch the Abraham Seaman tragedy, part 1, in order to understand the rest of this story, and take our Haunted Beacon ghost walk for the rest. We know that Abraham and Nellie were living at the Charles Mead Farm in Orange County. What we didn't know in our first video was that Abraham actually rented the farm and had crops, cattle, and horses of his own and was doing quite well. But by 1900, things began to spiral out of control for Abraham. He shot himself. Abraham said it was an accident while hunting, but Nellie and her mother said this was a suicide attempt because he was often depressed. Then his barn burned to the ground, destroying the cattle, horses, and produce. He received an insurance settlement that equaled $75,000 in today's value. So just where did that money go? Then their son died. We found out his name was Harold, and he was 11 years old, and is buried next to Abraham and Nellie in the Fairview Cemetery in Beacon. The next year, Abraham's 80-year-old father was hit by a train and killed. Then 2 intruders broke into his tiny one-room apartment in Matteawan and violently assaulted him. According to Nellie, he was scared they would do it again, so he purchased a gun and carried it wherever he went and slept with it at night. He hated his daughter's new husband, and the new husband cut off all contact with Nellie and Abraham, sending him deeper into depression. He grew extremely jealous of Nellie and followed her everywhere, which only made her more angry with him. Then the doctor informed him that he had an incurable sickness. He stopped working and didn't have a penny to his name. Nellie was often frustrated and angry with him, even violently attacking him. Why was she so angry? Then, allegedly, Nellie shot him in the middle of the night and was arrested, never given a trial, but declared insane and sent to the Matteawan prison. The neighbors testified that Nellie, probably jokingly, asked her daughter's husband and brother to get Abraham a job at the New York rubber factory and push him into the grinder to his death. We found out a year before the Seamans moved to town, an employee of the rubber factory actually did fall into the grinder and lost both his arms. One article said he did it by trying to put a stick in the grinder. In the end, it came out that the rubber factory's roof leaked water onto the floor and the poor man slipped into the grinder, and the other men rescued him and saved his life. He sued and, against his lawyer's better judgment, settled out of court for a mere $2,000, about $60,000 today. We found out more about Lizzie Halliday and why Nellie's neighbors compared her to this serial killer that was in the Matteawan Asylum. She was, without question, insane and had murdered a list of people and committed other crimes. Then, in 1906, 1 year before Nellie was arrested, a kind-hearted female attendant befriended Lizzie Halliday. She felt that she could tame Lizzie with respect and friendship. Lizzie's insane behavior escalated, though, when she found out that her attendant friend was leaving for another place of employment. She began to whisper threats toward this attendant. But the attendant felt that Lizzie would never harm her. Lizzie waited for just the right moment, locked her in a room, and knocked her down to the ground and stabbed her in the face and body 200 times until she died. No wonder the community was terrified that Nellie may also be the same kind of maniac. No wonder Nellie was terrified of going to the asylum with the other maniacs like Lizzie Halliday and tried to escape when the wagon came to bring her to the prison. The other reason Nellie was just like Lizzie Halliday was that Lizzie was actually a gypsy. She was connected with a tribe that encamped in Orange County near the James Mead Farm during the time when the Seamans lived there. Did Nellie know them? Did she visit them? Is that where she got the books? And at the time, people were very fearful of Gypsy, yet intrigued. Many would visit their camps to have their fortunes told. The authorities that were trying to prove Nellie's insanity found Gypsy books in her apartment. We talked about Nellie's lawyer, Mr. Meyer, having a daughter who became one of America's more famous fortune teller, even giving predictions to President FDR. The wealthy Tompkins family that ran the Tyranda hat factory provided a fortune teller at a lawn party held at the Edgewater estate. Palmist Madame Zingara had read people's fortunes for many years in Beacon in spite of her being arrested for fraud. Poor Nellie was accused of insanity for merely possessing a book. So, just who are these new ghosts we have found? For me, it all started with a book named House on Pancake Hill written by Jody Syke. I grew up with Jody, and I knew of the hauntings of her house back in the 1970s. The fact that they had ghost investigators come and confirm that their house was haunted was the talk of the town. Many people throughout the city of Beacon were curious and even a bit scared. Some were downright mean to this poor little girl who had abilities beyond what she and her family could understand. But adults often deal with their fears by mocking others. What I didn't know was just how horrifying these hauntings had been. The investigator said they didn't just have a ghost, they had an open portal. The house is in Beacon, New York, and sits between East Main and Spring Valley Streets. These streets used to be called Fountain and Mill Streets. We found an article in 1892 that stated a crew was digging on Fountain Street in Matteawn to add an addition to a building. They unearthed the skeleton of a man who, from appearances, had been in the ground for many years. Why was he there? Were there others in the area that were not unearthed? Then, in 1975, while fixing a sewer line, the water department had to dig 20 feet down and under the ground between East Main Street and Spring Valley Street near the area of Pancake Hill. And it was in 1975 that the hauntings in Pancake Hill leveled up from ghostly appearances to threatening poltergeists. The owners of Beacon Bath & Bubble at 458 Main Street became intrigued with the story of House on Pancake Hill, and after reading the book, their shop began to have strange occurrences. It got so bad they had a paranormal investigation done. We share these stories on our ghost walk, but for now, we just need to share the name of our first ghost, because it popped out of the equipment that is supposed to pick up words from spectral spirits hanging about. And the name that was brought forth was Henrietta. So we did our research and we found Henrietta Robinson, the veiled murderess. And she connects to Nellie Seaman, and it's fascinating. She was arrested and convicted of murder in 1853 and would die in the Matteawan Asylum for the criminally insane 2 years before Nellie would begin her time in the prison. Henrietta Robinson was not her true identity. She was a woman of mystery so intriguing her story was written about for many years in many newspapers and books. During her trial, she wore a dark blue veil over her face to hide her identity. The courtroom was filled with spectators. At one point, the judge became so frustrated with the veil that he demanded she show her face to him. So she rose to her feet and slowly lifted the veil to reveal a flash of an eerie smile and then slowly let the veil drop back down. It was said this wiped the judicial expression right off the face of the judge. Her beauty was always the focal point. The judge, lawyers, and prison keepers all agreed that she was gloriously and dangerously beautiful, but her beauty in the end did not save her. She was found guilty of poisoning her neighbors during a dinner shared with them in their home in Troy, New York. She was to be sent to Sing Sing prison for execution. Confident in her innocence, Henrietta was shocked to hear of her fate. She jumped to her feet, trembling with rage, and exclaimed, "I expected nothing less. The judge, the district attorney, the lawyers, and all who testified against me are corrupt. I was doomed before the trial began." Throughout her years in prison, she maintained her youthful appearance by picking herbs in the prison yard and making her own makeup and skincare. She slowly declined within the prison walls, yet many considered her to be attractive even into old age. Most of her time was spent in her room crocheting lace and updating her wardrobe. Overall, she was considered an easy patient to care for. She continually wore her veil and often came off distant and standoffish as if she felt she was above those around her. Henrietta declared she would take her secret to the grave with her rather than disgrace her family with her sins, and she did just that. She died at 89 years old as Henrietta Robinson, buried in grave number 88 in Potter's Field at the Matteawan Asylum. Once buried and forgotten, her childhood friend, Mrs. Norris, stepped forward to tell the world Henrietta's true identity. Mrs. Norris said that Henrietta had been born into a wealthy and well-connected family in Canada. Forced to leave her true love, Charlotte was strong-armed into a more suitable marriage to Sir William Elliot, Baronet of Staub, Scotland, and member of the British royal family, her title becoming Lady Elliot. After a few years in Britain, she became dreadfully miserable and deserted the nobleman and her two children. She fled back to her parents in Canada. They were furious that she had abandoned her family and rejected her. So she made her way to Troy, New York to find employment at the Emma Willard School, where she had once attended with her friend Mrs. Norris. She rented a house and decorated it lavishly with irreproachable taste. She seemed to have an abundance of money, and it seemed strange to her neighbors that such a beautiful, wealthy woman had no family or visitors and kept mostly to herself. She carried on an illicit affair with a local politician who married her in a private ceremony, but eventually he tired of her and disappeared from her life. She found out that he was to marry a more suitable and younger woman, and that her marriage to him was actually a sham. She began to mentally and emotionally unravel. There were rumors that she was pregnant and gave birth to a daughter in the Sing Sing prison. That was never proven, as her records were conveniently destroyed in a fire. She also started to carry around a gun and often made comments that she would make her lover pay for what he had done to her. Her predicament started, though, when she was invited to dinner at her neighbor's house, the Lanigans, who were found dead the next day from arsenic poisoning. Police searched Henrietta's house and found the poison under her rug. She denied buying or knowing about it. They arrested her for murder. She felt she had been railroaded to cover the sins of her politician lover and the reputation of the British royal family, and she hid her true identity to probably protect the future of her children. Mrs. Norris shared that Lady Elliot, due to her hidden identity, had lost a $500,000 inheritance worth about $20 million today. And worse than that, in her early weeks of imprisonment, awaiting her trial, her brother had visited the prison and Henrietta was smuggled out to preside as queen for 2 hours at a class reception at the Troy School. They gave her a beautiful Parisian gown to wear, complete with expensive jewels and accessories. She was introduced to her former schoolmates as Lady Elliot of Scotland, and they all recognized her as the girl they had once known. Their cover story was that she and her brother were traveling throughout America on vacation. Certainly she was not the veiled murderess. Once in the middle of her old friends, Henrietta simply stepped into her role of high society as if she had been holding court in Britain, forgetting that she would be back in the prison the next day. The men were breathless over her beauty and could not get enough of her presence. Henrietta enjoyed every minute and waved goodbye to her friends as she was taken away and back to the jail. This would end all gossip and suspicion that the wife of the British baronet was actually the veiled murderess that had been arrested for murder. Henrietta said they were successful in buncoing the world. Bunco is a slang for a swindle in which you cheat at gambling and persuade a person to buy worthless property. As an old woman, she shared her story with her female attendant at Matteawn. Asking many questions, the attendant was not only convinced the story was true, but was deeply moved at the tragedy that had been Lady Elliot's life. When asked about her second husband, her politician lover, she cried out, "I cursed the day I met him. All my trouble came from him, and yet I loved him, but now he's dead." When asked about her children, all she could do was cry. She said that she had suffered everything. Her liberty and reputation had been stolen by designing people, but she had kept her vows and her secret and shall carry them to her grave. She asked the attendant to tell her friend Mrs. Norris that she was well and happy, but because she was suffering from Bright's disease at the time, she said death would not be long. Now, take note of this next part, as it will resurface in the end. The article of the exchange before the Matteawan attendant and Lady Elliot came out in 1908, a year after Nellie had been sent to Matteawan. The attendant's final thought on the interview with Lady Elliot went as follows. As I came out of Matteawan, the flying squadrons of black clouds were massing sullenly in every part of the heavens, far over Storm King, where gleamed the rose and gold of the dying sun, and the afterglow of the sunset was like the peaceful ending of a tempestuous and troubled life. So like Nellie, Henrietta's life had been controlled and ruined by the men in her life. She had been used and tossed aside by a lover. She was railroaded, set up and shut up to end her days in the asylum. Apparently, Nellie wasn't the first woman snuck out the back door and forced to wear a costume. And if you haven't connected the dots by now, I'd like to ask, just where did the men in the village of Matteawan get the funeral dress and veil they forced Nellie to wear beside her husband's casket? Was this costume the dress and veil of Henrietta Robinson? Was this her scarlet letter, a message to Nellie that she was doomed to spend the rest of her days in the asylum as Henrietta had done? If it was, how unbelievably cruel. No wonder she broke down and wept bitterly. Now on to our next ghost. On our Haunted Beacon Ghost Walk in 2024, a guest on our tour was a man who had been conducting paranormal investigations for 20 years. He had a ghost communicator with him. We were standing in front of house on Pancake Hill. I was focusing on the story of the sinister ghost of a nun that woke Jody in the middle of the night and gave an eerie, cackling laugh as she disappeared into the wall. When Jody asked her neighbor, who had lived there for 80 years, why there seemed to be so many bricks in her garden, the woman replied that her grandmother had told her that was where the cottages once were, where the nuns lived. Creepy, right? This gives chills to everyone who hears this story. But it nagged at me. It nagged at me that nuns were living in those cottages. There was never a church anywhere near there. Then I found Nellie Seaman and the Beehive tenement next door to house on Pancake Hill. It was filled with poverty-stricken, alcohol and drug-addicted criminals. Was her neighbor saying that the nuns lived there as a wink and a nod to a different group of women that may have occupied the cottages? In trying to say this delicately to my tour group, the man's ghost communicator, which had been silent up to this point, blurted out, "Brothel." Our tour moved on to visit Beacon Bath and Bubble, where the paranormal investigation had been conducted in 2017, where Henrietta made her presence known. Talking about the story of the hauntings in the shop while peering into the windows, the ghost communicator once again blurted out a name. And it said Jen, or Jenny. And we found Jenny Blunt. Now, Nellie Seaman had been in the asylum for a year in 1908 when 20-year-old Jenny Blunt was arrested for murder. Jenny had come to a Mr. Charles Sanford's law office with a gun hidden beneath her coat. She waited for Charles to be distracted, took out the gun, and shot him in the head and fled the building. She was chased down by the police and taken to headquarters. There, while not knowing that Sanford had survived the shooting, Jenny obsessively talked about him, declaring that she was glad she had killed him and would gladly answer to God for her act. The attending physician said Jenny Blunt was a nervous, mental, and physical wreck. Mr. Sanford and his friends in high society maintained that Jenny's insanity alone prompted the shooting. However, Jenny's relatives bitterly lamented that it was Sanford's inhumanity that drove Jenny insane. A reporter approached Jenny's sister, a Mrs. Tuttle, to find out her thoughts on the shooting, to which she exclaimed, "My God, it has happened at last. I've been expecting Jenny to shoot Mr. Sanford for the past 3 weeks. He deserved it. And if he's not dead, it's a pity. What my sister has suffered at his hands was enough to drive any woman to commit murder. 7 years ago, Jenny was one of the prettiest and nicest girls in Mount Vernon. She came down to Brooklyn one day to visit me, and on her return, Sanford spotted her and cultivated her acquaintance and got her to come to visit him in his office. One of the side rooms in his office is fitted up like a studio. There is never any sunlight in it. He has a lamp burning there all the time with a red shade over it. There is a couch in the room, a lot of Eastern ornaments, rugs, cushions, and pictures. He has liquor there that he used to give her to drink. Long after their first meeting, I was there with her one day, and he gave her some of the stuff, and it affected her immediately. He tried to get another of my sisters to drink it, but she refused. And then Jenny, who was trying to get away from him, had been to the police court 3 times to have him arrested. Jenny took me by the arm and begged me to go to court with her. I didn't go, and I really don't know why. Long before that, she told me he had visited her in Mount Vernon and drugged her there. He drugged her all the time. For 5 years she was stupefied most of the time with the drugs. That was the way he maintained his influence over her. Jenny Blunt's lawyers tried to save her from a fate of the asylum like that of Nellie Seaman. They felt she was being railroaded by a wealthy and influential group of men who wanted to shut her up and shut her away. Jenny's lawyer stated, "We do not propose to have her sent to an asylum just because certain influences have been brought to bear to prevent her from taking the witness stand. Her story will parallel that of Evelyn Thaw. She will tell of orgies in the Oriental Den adjoining Sanford's office at numbers 26 Court Street, in which many other men as prominent as Sanford in Brooklyn's social life took part. Many young girls will be called to corroborate Jenny Blunt's story of drugged wine and of occurrences which were features of the entertainments given there." Jenny's lawyers were determined that the names of these men will be told at the trial. They felt this was why they were trying to have Jenny thrown in the asylum and not given a trial by jury. "We searched for the list of men's names and the names of the other young victims, found nothing. Even now, in 2025, at the time of this recording, we are waiting for the same kind of lists of names." Jenny Blunt was sentenced to 4 years in prison for attempted murder. Poor Jenny broke down sobbing and begged the judge not to do this to her. In her prison cell, she tried to escape by attempting suicide, but did not succeed. And because of this, she was declared hopelessly insane. She was sent to Matteawn. She spent the rest of her life in New York State institutions, dying imprisoned at 73 years old. Just as Evelyn Nesbit was drugged and raped by Stanford White, and as Harry Thaw, who tried to rid the world of Evelyn's predator only to end up in Matteawn, Jenny joins the web of the Matteawan mystery. Nellie may have inherited the dress and sentence of Henrietta Robinson, but she may have met Jenny when she arrived at Matteawan. What was their experience like within the walls of the prison? We move on to Harry Thaw and the Matteawan investigation.